Let the day fall behind you. Find your comfort and let your mind begin to slow. Let yourself drift toward the silent remains of a city no one expected to find. If this brings you rest, subscribe, and there'll be a new one waiting tomorrow night. From altitude, in the middle of the afternoon, the Supa Valley looks like a place where nothing ever happened. The desert floor stretches pale and flat between the hills. The river is a dark thread below, a thin line of water running west toward the Pacific, through a landscape that otherwise refuses it. From a survey plane crossing the north-central Peruvian coast in the 1940s, the valley would have appeared exactly as it appeared to every other observer who had ever passed over it. A dry, unpeopled corridor of sand and stone, the hills behind it brown and bare, the light coming down hard and even across everything, flattening the shadows and making all distances feel approximately the same. And yet the mounds were there. They rose from the terrace above the river in shapes that were not quite natural and not quite architectural. Broad, flat-topped forms with gentle slopes and pale surfaces, their outlines softened by wind and time, large enough to be seen from the air, but easy, in that flat and featureless landscape, to read as geological accident rather than human intention. They had been there for approximately 4,000 years. By the time any survey aircraft crossed above them, they would remain effectively unread for another 50. Paul Kosok flew surveys of this coastline in the 1940s. His name is better known in connection with the Nazca lines, those enormous geoglyphs pressed into the desert floor further south. Animals, geometric forms, long straight lines running for kilometers across the plain without apparent purpose. Kosok documented the Nazca figures from the air and brought them to wider scholarly attention, and the work he did there was careful and rigorous and genuinely transformative for the study of ancient Peru. But the Supa Valley was also beneath his aircraft at some point in those years, and the mounds that rise from the terrace above the river were also, in some sense, visible to anyone looking down. They did not register as what they were. This is not a story about deliberate blindness. It is not a story about institutions with agendas or scholars unwilling to see. It is something simpler and in its own way more interesting, the story of how a methodological assumption, reasonable in its own terms, quietly directed a generation of professional attention away from one of the most extraordinary places in the ancient world. The assumption was this, that pottery was a prerequisite for complex civilization, that the presence of ceramics, fired clay vessels, decorated or plain, was the reliable indicator that a society had reached the organizational threshold at which urban life, monumental construction, and social hierarchy could exist. No ceramics, the professional framework held, meant no city, and the mounds of the Supa Valley contained no ceramics at all. The surface of the site was clear. There were no sherds in the soil. There were no fragments of fired clay accumulating in the dry terrace above the river. Survey after survey, passing glance after passing glance, returned from the Supa Valley without finding the diagnostic material that would have triggered serious excavation, and without that trigger, the mounds went on sitting there in the afternoon light, their flat tops casting short shadows, their interiors holding everything they had always held, uncounted and undisturbed. The valley itself was not entirely undiscovered. It had a name. The river had a name. The terrace where the mound stood was accessible on foot from the nearest town, and local people had been aware of the earthen forms for as long as anyone could remember. But awareness and recognition are different things, and the professional apparatus of Andean archaeology had for most of the 20th century oriented itself toward sites that yielded the material it had been trained to value. The Supe Valley mounds, stripped of ceramics and therefore stripped of the category that would have made them legible, weighted to understand the shape of that weighting. It helps to hold the actual size of the site in mind. The largest mound at the location that would eventually be called Corral rises to a height of approximately 18 meters. Its base covers an area of roughly 150 by 160 meters. To build it, an estimated 100,000 cubic meters of material had to be gathered, organized, and placed by human hands in a landscape where no metal tools existed and no draft animals were available to carry loads. Around it, 5 other major platform mounds stand at varying scales, each requiring its own enormous commitment of organized labor, each facing specific directions, each occupying a position within a spatial arrangement that is plainly deliberate. The full area of the city's core covers approximately 66 hectares, a site large enough that a person walking its perimeter would cover a distance that takes real time and real effort to complete. None of this was invisible. The forms were there, standing in the desert light, shaped by human decisions made across generations, filled with material that would eventually yield its dates to the right laboratory equipment. The site simply lacked the ceramic signature that the professional literature had established as the marker of its own significance. And so, for decade after decade, the significance sat quietly inside the mounds and waited for the right question to be asked of it. Ruth Shady Solis asked it in 1994. She was a Peruvian archaeologist affiliated with the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in Lima, which is the oldest university in the Americas, a detail that carries a particular resonance in a story about things being older than expected, older than the conventional frameworks allowed for. Her interest in the Supe Valley had developed through years of working in the Andean region, and by the early 1990s, she had reason to believe that the mounds above the river warranted serious, sustained investigation rather than the occasional and inconclusive survey they had received. In 1994, she initiated the first scientifically rigorous excavation of the site. The word rigorous is worth holding for a moment. It means something specific here. It means systematic, documented fieldwork with careful stratigraphic control, the excavation of soil layers in the correct sequence, with each layer's contents recorded before moving to the next, so that the sequence of occupation and construction can be read backward through time with some confidence. It means the collection and labeling of organic material for laboratory analysis. It means field notebooks and site plans and scale drawings and a methodology designed to produce results that other researchers can evaluate and, if necessary, challenge. It means, in short, the kind of work that produces knowledge rather than merely impressions. The fieldwork began on a site that had been sitting largely untouched for millennia, in a valley where the desert air preserved organic material with extraordinary fidelity. And what came out of the ground over the following years was a sequence of findings that would eventually rewrite the standard account of civilization in the Western Hemisphere. But that rewriting took time, and it took a particular form of scientific confirmation before the scholarly community would take the findings at the scale they warranted. The confirmation came from radiocarbon dating, organic material recovered from the interior of Corral's platform mounds, plant fibers, charred plant remains, material that had been sealed inside the construction filled by the labor of the city's builders, was submitted for analysis. Radiocarbon dating works by measuring the ratio of 2 carbon isotopes in organic material, the isotope that decays at a known rate after an organism dies, and the stable isotope that remains constant. By comparing the two, A laboratory can calculate, within a margin of statistical probability, how long ago the organism in question ceased to exchange carbon with the atmosphere, which is to say, how long ago the plant was harvested, the wood was burned, or the fiber was woven. The results return dates that clustered around 2600 BCE. Some samples extended the occupation of the site back further still, to approximately 3000 BCE. The range was not a single clean number, but a distribution of dates across different contexts, different mounds, different construction phases, the accumulated record of a city that had been built, modified, added to, and rebuilt across centuries of continuous occupation, not a single act of construction, but a sustained commitment to place and to the particular kind of social organization that monumental architecture requires. These dates and the analysis supporting them were published in 2001 in a landmark paper in the journal Science. The authors were Shady Solis, Jonathan Haas, and Winifred Creamer. The paper established, on the basis of physical evidence subjected to rigorous scientific testing, that the site in the Supe Valley above the river was not a modest pre-ceramic settlement of the kind that Andean archaeology had occasionally documented elsewhere, but a major urban center of extraordinary antiquity, one of the oldest cities in the world, and the oldest known in the Western Hemisphere, by a margin that made the comparison difficult to absorb. The Great Pyramid at Giza was begun around 2560 BCE. Karl's construction was already underway before that. The Sumerian city of was flourishing at approximately the same time. The Indus Valley cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were contemporaries. Karl was not a peripheral curiosity or an early experiment that prefigured later development. It was part of the same broad historical moment in which human populations in several places on the planet, without any apparent contact with each other, crossed a threshold into the kind of organized, monumental, socially stratified urban life that we typically call civilization. And it had been sitting in the desert above the Supe River, its mounds bleached and flat-topped and full of undated organic material, for the better part of the 20th century. The science paper did not end all debate. Papers of this significance rarely do. Questions were raised about the reliability of the dating in specific contexts, about whether the organic materials were securely associated with the construction phases they were assumed to come from, about whether the term city was being applied to the site with the precision it required. These were legitimate scholarly questions, and they were engaged with seriously by Shady Solis and her collaborators in subsequent years of continued fieldwork. The dates held, the interpretation held, the consensus that formed around the evidence in the years following publication was robust enough that Corral's significance became in archaeological terms settled, not universally agreed upon in every detail, but accepted as the foundational reference point for any serious account of early civilization in the Americas. All of this knowledge came from a place that had been photographed from above and walked past on the ground and surveyed with professional instruments and found again and again to be without the single marker that the prevailing framework required before it would look closely. The valley itself has not changed. The terrace above the river is still dry. The hills are still bare. The light still comes down flat, and even in the afternoon, and the Supe River still runs its thin, dark line through the valley floor toward the Pacific, a narrow ribbon of green following the water through an otherwise pale and windless landscape. Standing on the terrace where the mounds are, the sea is not visible, only the western hills, and beyond them an invisible coast where fishing boats once worked. The cold, nutrient-rich current that would prove in time to be as central to the story of Corral as anything buried in the mounds themselves. But that is a question for the soil and the laboratory. The surface, seen from any direction in any era, offers the same quiet face, a terrace above a river, a handful of broad earthen forms, a sky that holds no indication of what lies beneath it. The 2001 paper itself, printed and bound in the journal's red covers, was the kind of document that gets marked up by readers trying to situate what it says against what they already know. A reader comparing dates, running a pencil line in the margin beside the radiocarbon range, and writing a note against it. 2600 BCE, Giza would have had to pause, not from shock, but from the particular sensation of a familiar scale being revised. Everything the reader knew about when civilization began in the Americas, about which cultures had cities and which had not yet arrived at that threshold, would have shifted slightly to accommodate the number on the page. This is how knowledge accumulates, not in single moments of revelation, but in the slow incremental adjustment of frameworks against new evidence, each adjustment small in itself, the aggregate over time enormous. The adjustment Corral required was not small. It asked the entire field of American prehistory to push its starting date for urban complexity back by more than 1,000 years, to accept that a city existed in South America at the same time as the Old Kingdom of Egypt, without any of the markers, ceramics, metal tools, writing, domesticated animals for hauling, that the conventional model had treated as prerequisites, not as a minor regional phenomenon, but as a fully developed urban center with monumental architecture, organized labor, long-distance trade, and a population large enough to sustain all of it. The framework had not been wrong. Exactly. It had simply been calibrated against evidence that was itself incomplete. Carroll was the missing calibration point. It was the thing that once found revealed the gap. Kosak's aerial photographs from the 1940s still exist. The images of the Supe Valley taken from the survey plane are the earliest documented aerial records of the site. Pale geometric forms against a pale landscape. The mounds visible as slightly elevated from slightly regular shapes in a photograph that was taken for reasons that had nothing to do with them. They are in retrospect a kind of record of the not yet known, images of something real and present and unrecognized, taken by a careful and accomplished researcher who was looking at other things. There is no blame in this. The photographs are interesting precisely because they are unaware of themselves as significant. The shapes in them are just shapes, slightly raised, slightly regular, undramatic in the flat light of the valley. A person looking at them without the 2001 dating paper in hand would see nothing more than a geographer saw in the 1940s, which is to say, not quite nothing, but nothing that required immediate attention. The mounds required attention. They required the particular kind of attention that involves returning to a site season after season, opening trenches in the right places, collecting the right materials with the right degree of care, and submitting them to a laboratory for analysis, whose results would take months to return, and whose interpretation would take years to argue through. Shady Salis provided that attention. The University of San Marcos provided the institutional framework within which the fieldwork could proceed. The journal Science provided the venue in which the findings could be placed before the international scholarly community in a form that the community could evaluate. All of this was necessary, and none of it was quick, and by the time it was complete, the mounds had been sitting above the Supe River for roughly 5,000 years. 5,000 years is long enough that the phrase becomes difficult to hold as a duration rather than a number. But the physical materials inside the mounds experience no such difficulty. They simply are what they are, exactly as old as they are, unchanged in their basic chemistry by any opinion about what they mean. The plant fibers sealed inside the construction fill were placed there by workers who lived in a functioning city. The fibers dried in the desert air. The desert air kept them millennia past. The laboratory measured the carbon ratio, returned the date, and the age of the fibers was as indifferent to its own significance as it had always been. Among the organic materials recovered from Carroll and submitted for dating were woven net bags made from rushes and grasses, a distinctive form of construction technology in which bags filled with quarried stone rubble were stacked inside the mound's interior frameworks as a stable fill. These bags, called shikra bags, appear throughout the mounds wherever excavation has opened cross-sections of the construction fill, their woven texture preserved with unusual clarity by the dry conditions that prevail in the valley. They are a kind of record in themselves, evidence of the labor system that built the mounds, of the plant materials available in the valley, of the weavers who made them, and the workers who filled them, and the builders who placed them in sequence inside the growing structure. Some of the shikra bags recovered during excavation were intact enough to be removed from the ground and placed on conservation tables for examination. The knots at their necks were still tight. The weave of the rush fibers was still legible. They had not been touched since the moment they were set in place and covered by the next layer of construction fill, which may have been 5,000 years ago, or may have been somewhat less, depending on the specific context of each bag's recovery. The radiocarbon dates assigned to this kind of material are statistical distributions, ranges of probability, rather than single points, and the range for Carl's construction is broad enough to encompass several centuries of building activity at the site. Some of those bags were collected and placed in the queue for radiocarbon analysis. In a laboratory, a glass vial sealed with a rubber stopper holds a small quantity of dried plant fiber taken from the interior of one of the mounds, a few centimeters of woven rush, dry and pale and unremarkable, bearing a paper label printed with a sample code and the name of the site. The vial sits in a queue with other vials from other sites and other projects, waiting for analysis. It is one sample among many. The lab does not know yet, in the moment before the analysis is run, what the date will return. No one who handles the vial has any particular reason to treat it with more care than any other sample, because it has not yet been revealed to be, among other things, among the oldest evidence of urban life in the entire Western Hemisphere. It is simply a vial, a sealed glass container, a paper label, a small knot of dried plant fiber from a valley in coastal Peru that nobody, passing it on the laboratory bench, would look at twice. That ordinariness is part of the record, the evidence for Corral's extraordinary age and significance did not announce itself dramatically. It accumulated in exactly the same slow, procedural, undramatic way that all archaeological evidence accumulates, in field notebooks and soil samples and labeled bags and carefully drawn site plans and vials of organic material waiting in laboratory queues, each piece unremarkable in isolation, the whole picture assembling itself only as the data comes back and the dates are read and the comparisons are made and the paper is written and peer-reviewed and published, and slowly, over years, absorbed into the understanding that the discipline of archaeology maintains about the past. The vial in the queue does not know what it holds. The fiber inside it has been dry for 5,000 years without knowing anything about the debates its age would eventually generate, or the frameworks it would require scholars to revise, or the particular sensation a reader would have, pencil in hand, comparing its date to the beginning of the Great Pyramid. The fiber simply exists at the temperature of the room, inside the glass, under the rubber stopper, on the bench in the queue waiting, and somewhere above the Supe River, The mounds stand in the afternoon light, exactly as they always have, flat-topped, pale, their slopes softened by wind, their interiors holding the construction fill that workers placed inside them in a sequence that will never be entirely recovered. The shikra bags still stacked in the layers that the trench walls have not yet reached. The desert air still doing its quiet work of preservation. The river still running its narrow line of water through the valley below. The site was not found by accident. It was found by work, by sustained, systematic, undramatic professional effort applied to a place that had been present all along. The mounds did not reveal themselves. They were revealed slowly by people who looked closely enough, long enough, and with the right instruments. The slowness is part of the story. The accumulation of evidence across years of fieldwork is part of the story. The vial in the laboratory queue is part of the story, not the ending, not the dramatic revelation, but one more ordinary object in a long sequence of ordinary objects that together, when the dates come back and the paper is written and the journal is printed and the margins are annotated, add up to something that changes the shape of the known past. The vial sits in the queue, the label is printed, the fiber is dry, the analysis has not yet been run. At the base of the pyramid Mayer, the excavation trench runs along the mound's southern face, and in the wall of that trench, at roughly eye height for a person standing on the valley floor, the interior of the mound is exposed. The stones are not laid in courses. They do not present the dressed, fitted faces of a wall built to be seen. What the trench reveals instead is something packed, dense, and organic, rounded shapes of woven fiber pressed tightly together inside the mound's body, each one holding its form after nearly 5,000 years, their grassy texture still legible in the morning light, a measuring tape laid alongside them reading out their dimensions in quiet centimeters. These are the shikra bags. Each one was woven from rush and grass, filled with quarried stone rubble, knotted at the neck, and stacked with others to build up the interior mass of the platform. No mortar held them. No precisely cut stone was required. The material was simple, and the method was practical, and the result, when multiplied across hundreds of thousands of these bags inside a single mound, was a structure that has held its shape across a span of time that makes most of recorded history look brief. The shikra bags were not an improvisation. The evidence from the trench wall is that they were a deliberate engineering solution, one that distributed the mass of the mound evenly and bound the fill into a stable internal framework through nothing more elaborate than weight and weave. The mound they built rises steeply above the trench. Standing at its base and looking up, the upper platform is inaccessible, the staircase climbing the mound's face, reaching toward a summit that catches whatever light the afternoon brings and holds it against a sky that is, at this latitude, almost always clear. The pyramid Mayer stands approximately 18 meters high. Its base measures roughly 150 meters by 160 meters, a footprint large enough that a person walking its perimeter at an ordinary pace would spend several minutes completing the circuit. To fill that volume required an estimated 100,000 cubic meters of material, delivered bag by bag, knotted and stacked in a sequence of labor that unfolded not in a single generation, but across time, the mound growing incrementally as the city itself grew. The platform mounds at Corral were not, as excavation has confirmed, built once and left. The archaeology shows episodes of construction, enlargement, and rebuilding layered into the mound's stratigraphy, new fill placed over old, new surfaces prepared above earlier ones, the whole structure accreting across the decades and centuries of the city's occupation. The shikra bags in the trench wall record these episodes in cross-section. Some bags are pressed tight against others that are clearly older, their rush fibers at a slightly different angle, their fillstone of a slightly different character. The mound is in this sense a kind of document, a record of sustained collective effort, legible to anyone patient enough to read a trench wall the way a geologist reads an outcrop. The Pyramid Mare is the largest of Carroll's 6 major platform mounds, but it does not stand alone in the site's landscape. The other mounds are distributed across the city's core area, each one a distinct mass rising from the dry terrace above the Supe River, each one carrying its own staircase, its own summit platform, its own position within the arrangement that constitutes the city's plan. Carroll covers approximately 66 hectares in total, a site large enough that walking from one mound to another takes time, that the space between structures is itself significant, that the city has a scale the visitor must travel across rather than simply observe. The 6 major mounds do not repeat each other. Their sizes differ. Their orientations differ. Excavation has suggested that each served a distinct function within the life of the city, religious, administrative, or some combination that the physical evidence indicates without fully specifying. Between the mounds, in the spaces that might seem like empty ground, Carroll's excavators have found the circular plazas. These are sunken enclosures, semi-subterranean structures dug below the surrounding grade and contained by low retaining walls of stone that curve around the interior perimeter. Standing at the rim of one of these plazas and looking down into it, the curved retaining wall follows the circle around on all sides, and the floor below, packed earth, swept clean, lies perhaps a meter or two below the level of the surrounding terrain. Directly ahead, the mound staircase rises from the plaza edge toward the mound's summit platform, so that the plaza and the mound face each other across a compressed vertical distance, the depth of the plaza meeting the height of the mound in a spatial relationship that feels, even in the documentary record of excavation photographs, intentional and held. These sunken circular plazas have been interpreted by researchers as communal gathering spaces, places where large numbers of people could stand or sit, oriented toward the mound above, participating in collective ceremonies or ritual performances that the physical arrangement was designed to accommodate. The bowl shape of the plaza would have gathered sound. The retaining wall would have defined the boundary of the gathered group. The mound staircase, rising directly from the plaza's edge, would have provided a focal point visible from every position within the enclosure. The architecture did not require walls to divide inside from outside, did not require a roof to declare sacred space. It used depth and height, the contrast of the sunken and the elevated, to organize the experience of people standing within it. Carroll's circular plazas survive today as open enclosures, their floors bare, their retaining walls standing to varying heights depending on the extent of excavation and conservation. A photograph taken from the rim of one of these plazas, looking down and inward, shows the curve of the wall following around the interior, the packed earth of the floor below, and the mound staircase rising directly ahead at the plaza's far edge. The staircase blocks are worn. The retaining wall stones are uncoursed but stable, fitted together without mortar in the dry stone tradition that characterizes most of Carl's construction. The plaza floor in the photograph shows no permanent features, no fire pit, no altar, no fixed installation of any kind that the camera captures, only the smooth packed earth of a surface that was prepared and maintained, used and kept clean, across what excavation suggests was a very long period of continuous occupation. The 6 major mounds and their associated plazas do not account for all of Karl's built area. The city also contains residential zones, areas of smaller, lower structures, whose stone walls and floor plans record something of the ordinary texture of life in a city this old. These residential areas are differentiated, and the differentiation is spatial as well as material. The structures located closest to the monumental mounds are larger and better constructed than those positioned at greater distances from the civic core. The walls of the inner residential zone are more carefully fitted. The floor area is more generous. The construction quality, measured in the precision of the stonework and the evident investment of labor, distinctly higher than what the outer residential zone shows. This is not a subtle distinction. An excavator moving from one residential zone to the other is moving between structures that feel different in hand and eye, the difference between a wall that was fitted with care and a wall that was fitted with speed, between a room that was made with attention and a room that was made with sufficiency. The archaeology records this distinction without resolving every question about what it meant socially. The proximity of larger, better-made structures to the civic and religious core of the site suggests that some residents lived closer to the center of institutional life than others, and that this proximity was also reflected in the quality of what was built for them. The outer residential structures are smaller, their walls less precisely made, their floor areas smaller, their position on the terrace further from the base of the nearest mound. A residential structure near the base of one of Karl's mounds, not in the outermost zone, but not directly adjacent to the mound staircase either, has been excavated to reveal low stone walls still standing to approximately waist height, a narrow doorway facing east, and an interior floor area small enough that a person could cross it in 4 or 5 steps. The room is not empty in the way that emptied rooms are empty. Its floor preserves traces of use, the faint staining of old surfaces, the compact density of a floor that was walked on. The doorway faces east in the way that doorways at several Karl structures face east, an orientation that may be practical, may be intentional, may be both, and that the archaeology records without fully explaining. The stone walls of this structure are not tall. They never were. The excavated evidence does not suggest a second story or a roofed interior of any significant height. The room was low and close, its ceiling formed by whatever perishable material was laid across the wall tops, long gone now, leaving the walls as open brackets against the sky. The desert air moves through the room as the desert air moves through everything at Karl, without obstruction, without humidity, with the particular dryness that is responsible for the extraordinary preservation of organic material across the site. It is the same dryness that preserved the shikra bags. It is the same dryness that preserved the plant fibers in the offering niches inside the mounds. It is, in a sense, the reason so much of Karl is still readable, still present, still capable of being excavated and described. The shikra bag system, that dense, practical, apparently humble method of building massive structures without cut stone or mortar, has drawn considerable attention from engineers and archaeologists alike. A single shikra bag recovered intact from one of Karl's mounds and laid out on a conservation table tells the full story in miniature. The rush fibers that form the bag's body are woven in a simple pattern, functional rather than decorative. The bag's neck was knotted shut after filling, and the knot, still tied, still holding, still in the shape that whoever tied it left it in, is made from the same rush fiber as the bag itself. The stones inside have shifted slightly with time, but remain within the bag's body, held by the weave. The bag is the size of a large sack, roughly the scale of something a person could carry, doubled-handed, heavy but not impossible. Multiplied across the interior of the pyramid mare, 100,000 cubic meters of fill, each cubic meter representing multiple bags. Each bag carried up the mound's slope and positioned by the hands of someone whose name the record does not preserve. The scale of the construction project becomes something that arithmetic can describe, but perhaps not fully convey. The bags were not brought from far away. The quarried stone rubble that filled them was local. The rushes and grasses that formed them were available along the Supe River and its margins. The labor was local too, organized and directed in ways that the archaeology records in its results, but not in its mechanisms. The mound rises as evidence of coordinated, sustained collective effort, but the specific organization of that effort has not left a document that excavation has recovered. What excavation has recovered in the shikra bags and the mound stratigraphy and the platform architecture is the output of that effort. The mound itself is the record. Its height and volume are the measure of what was accomplished. The preservation of the bags inside it is the measure of how the accomplishment was made, not with the monumental stone-cutting technology that characterizes contemporary construction projects elsewhere in the ancient world, but with locally gathered organic material packed into nets and stacked by the weight of labor and time. The summit platform of the pyramided mare, once reached by the mound staircase that rises from the plaza below, would have looked out over the full extent of the city. From that height, the other 5 major mounds are visible across the terrace, their flat tops at lower elevations, their plazas at their bases opening toward the central area between them. The Supe River is visible to the south and west, its thin green corridor of vegetation threading through the otherwise pale and dry landscape of the valley floor. The hills on either side of the valley rise bare and brown, their slopes offering no vegetation, no shade, no relief from the light that at this latitude and altitude is constant and strong. The city sits on its terrace between the river and the hills, organized and purposeful, its 6 major mounds marking the positions of its institutional life, the way the tallest buildings of any city mark, where the center of things lies. From the summit platform, the arrangement of the sunken circular plazas below the mounds would be particularly clear. Each plaza is paired with its mound, the sunken enclosure at the mound's base, providing the communal ground that the elevated platform above it addresses. The pairing is consistent across the site. Where there is a mound of significant size, excavation has found evidence of a plaza associated with it. The 2 elements working together in a spatial grammar that organizes the relationship between height and depth, between the elevated and the gathered, into something that the architecture repeats across the city in a way that suggests it was deliberate and understood. The dry terrace that Carol occupies above the Supe River is not a hospitable place in the way that hospitable places are usually described. The desert comes to the edge of the irrigated strip that the river makes possible, and beyond that strip it is simply pale and still. The wind moves across the terrace at certain hours, carrying the fine dust of the surrounding landscape, settling it on every exposed surface, covering the mound tops and the plaza floors and the stone walls of the residential structures in a thin, continuous layer of pale material that is itself, in its way, a form of preservation, the slow burial that keeps things from eroding faster than they otherwise might. The excavation that has revealed Carol's architecture has reversed this accumulation, layer by layer, in the patient work that field archaeology requires. A trench dug into a platform mound's face proceeds through stratified deposits of wind-blown sediment and construction fill, each layer dated by its position and by the organic material it contains, The whole sequence read in reverse, newest at the top, oldest at the bottom, until the original construction surface is reached and documented. The shikra bags appear at the depths appropriate to the mound's earliest building episodes, their preservation a consequence of the same dry conditions that preserved everything organic at the site. Above them, in later construction layers, other bags appear, slightly different in their fiber composition or their fillstone, recording a later episode of building in material that the excavator's trowel distinguishes from what lies below. This layered quality of Carroll's architecture, its evidence of rebuilding and enlargement over time, its accumulation of construction episodes within the body of each mound, gives the site a depth that aerial photographs do not reveal. The mounds from above look like finished forms, their flat tops and sloped sides presenting complete profiles against the surrounding terrain. From inside a trench cut through their walls, they reveal themselves as histories, built accumulations in which each phase of construction overlies an earlier one, in which the city's own development is recorded in the stratification of its most massive built elements. The pyramid mayor did not appear fully formed. It grew, it was added to, it was reshaped, its surface renewed, its volume increased across a period of occupation that radiocarbon analysis has placed within a range spanning several centuries. The residential structures at Carroll's outer margins record a different pace of accumulation. These structures are not large. Their walls did not require the organized labor that the platform mounds demanded. A single household or a small group could have built and maintained a structure of the dimensions that excavation has found in Carroll's outer residential zone. Low stone walls, a threshold, a floor, a roof of perishable material. The stones in the walls of these structures are less carefully fitted than those in the inner residential zone, but they are stable. They have held their position across the same 5,000 years that the shikra bags inside the mounds have held theirs. The desert's dryness and the valley's stable climate conspiring to preserve the entire built landscape of the city at a level of detail that excavation can document and describe. A narrow doorway in a residential structure near the outer edge of Carroll's residential district faces east. Its threshold stone is wider than it is tall, set flat at the base of the doorway opening, its upper surface worn smooth at the center, a shallow depression ground into the stone by the repeated passage of feet crossing it. The accumulated friction of entrances and exits across what must have been a long period of use. The wear is not dramatic, it is subtle, the kind of detail that requires close attention in the field to notice, that shows up in excavation photographs as a slightly lighter tone at the center of a dark stone surface. But it is there, and it is legible, and it means what all threshold wear means, that this was a place where people came and went, that the room beyond it was entered and left with enough frequency over enough time to leave a physical mark on the stone beneath the door. The room beyond the threshold is small. Its floor area, documented in the excavation plan, is the size of a modest sleeping space. The walls rise to their preserved height on 3 sides, the 4th side partially collapsed, the stone fallen inward and left by excavators in the position it fell to, a record of the structure's slow decline after the occupation that wore the threshold smooth. The interior of the room offers no fixed features, no hearth built into the floor, no storage niche cut into the wall, no permanent installation of any kind that excavation has found intact. What the room preserves is its dimensions and its orientation, its threshold stone and its wall construction, the bare facts of its architecture, from which everything else about its former life must be inferred carefully or left unanswered. The desert wind moves through this room now, as it moved through it 5,000 years ago, freely, without a roof to deflect it, without a door to close against it. The threshold stone sits at the base of the opening, its worn center facing east. The light that falls across it at any given hour, determined by the same solar geometry that determined it when feet were crossing it regularly. The hills behind the city rise in the same positions they occupied then. The river follows the same course through the valley below. The dry terrace where Corral sits is unchanged in its fundamental character, pale, still, slightly elevated above the green of the irrigated strip, looking west toward hills that block the Pacific and east toward the slope of the Andean foothills, rising into a sky that at this hour, in this season, holds no cloud. The 6 major mounds of Corral stand on this terrace in their documented positions, their shikra interiors intact beneath their exposed exterior faces, their summit platforms accessible now by the same staircase routes that excavation has cleared of accumulated sediment and stabilized for modern visitors. The sunken circular plazas at their bases are open to the same sky they were built beneath. The residential structures in both zones of the city stand to their preserved heights, their walls casting the short shadows that the angle of the sun at this latitude produces at most hours of the day. The shadow lines moving slowly across the stone floors as they have always moved, marking the passage of time by the oldest available method. What Corral's architecture records, taken as a whole, is not a single construction event, but a sustained engagement with a specific place over a long period of time. The mounds grew, the plazas were used and maintained, the residential structures were built, occupied, and in some cases rebuilt. The city was not assembled in a single coordinated effort and then left. It was lived in, worked on, maintained, and added to across a span of occupation that the radiocarbon dates place within the 3rd millennium BCE, a period remote enough that almost nothing else from the Western Hemisphere survives with comparable completeness or comparable scale. The shikra bag in the conservation facility recovered intact from one of the mound's interior construction episodes, its rush fiber still holding the shape of the stones it once carried, its neck knot still tied in the pattern that someone's hands made nearly 5,000 years ago, is the most direct physical contact the present moment has with the labor that built Corral. It is not a ceremonial object. It is not a monument. It is a container, functional and ordinary, made for the specific purpose of carrying fill material up a slope and into a growing structure, and then sealed inside that structure as the construction continued upward. It was never meant to be found. It was placed inside the mound as a means to an end, and the end was the mound itself, and the mound was the end of what the city needed that particular season, and the city was the end of what the people living on that dry terrace above the Super River had organized themselves to create. The worn center of the threshold stone in the outer residential doorway carries a different kind of evidence, not of construction labor, but of daily passage, the accumulated weight of ordinary comings and goings across a surface that was used so consistently and for so long that the stone itself recorded the use. The 2 objects the shikra bag still knotted inside the mound, the threshold stone, worn smooth at its center, at the base of the doorway, are different in every respect except the fact of their survival. Both are evidence. Both carry the record of a city that was built and lived in over a very long period on a dry terrace above a desert river, in a place that no map of the ancient world identified until excavation began to read what the surface had been quietly showing for for centuries. The pyramid mare stands above both of them, its flat top catching the afternoon light the way it has always caught it, its shikra bag interior packed and stable beneath the surface that the excavation trenches have exposed. The sunken circular plaza at its base is open and still. The residential doorway to the east faces the same direction it always faced, its threshold worn, its room beyond small and dim, the desert air moving through it in the particular way that desert air moves through an open space, without moisture, without resistance, carrying only the dust of the surrounding hills and the faint temperature of whatever the sun has done to the surface around it in the hours before this moment. The threshold stone sits at the center of the doorway opening. Its worn surface catches whatever light reaches it at this hour. The room beyond is quiet in the way that rooms 5,000 years old and open to the sky are quiet, not the quiet of abandonment, exactly, but the quiet of a place where time has simply accumulated without urgency, where the dust has settled in the same slow rhythm for so long that the settling itself is part of what the place is now. The walls stand to their preserved height on three sides. The fallen stones of the fourth wall lie where they fell. The floor inside is pale and smooth and barren, and the desert wind crosses it in a direction that has not changed, and the light that falls through the open doorway marks the same angle on the floor that it has always marked at this hour, in this season, at this latitude above the Supi River, where the city sits on its terrace and the hills rise dry around it, and the threshold stone in the outer doorway holds the worn memory of all the ordinary life that passed across it. A regional survey map of the north-central Peruvian coast, laid flat on a field table in the early morning, shows 4 river valleys running parallel from the Andean foothills down to the Pacific. The valleys are thin green lines on an otherwise pale page. Printed along each of those green lines, and scattered in the desert zones between them, are small numbered circles, 30 of them in total, each one marking the location of a known settlement site, each one sitting quietly on the paper as though it had always been there, which, in a manner of speaking, it had. The distances between the circles are small enough to measure with a thumb. The Pacific coast runs along the left edge of the paper. The Andean foothills close in along the right. Between those two margins, across roughly 90 kilometers of coastal desert and river-cut valley, something was built and organized and maintained for centuries before anyone from outside that landscape thought to record it. That map did not exist for most of the 20th century. The circles were not drawn because the settlements had not been identified. The survey work that made the map possible came slowly, built from decades of field work distributed across 4 valleys, conducted by researchers who had to find the sites before they could begin the longer work of understanding what those sites had once been part of. The map is, in one sense, simply a piece of paper with circles on it. In another sense, it is the shape of something that took a very long time to see. The 4 valleys the map depicts each carry a river from the Andes to the Pacific. From north to south, those rivers are the Fortaleza, the Pativilca, the Supe, and the Huara. Each one cuts through the Peruvian coastal desert, a strip of arid land where almost nothing grows without water drawn deliberately from the river. The valleys themselves are narrow green corridors, irrigable and productive where the river runs, barren within a short distance of either bank. The hills above the valley floors are pale, rocky, and empty. A traveler moving between settlements in any of these valleys would have moved along the river, staying close to the water, measuring distance in the rhythms of a day's walking, rather than in any abstract unit of measure. The Norte Chico civilization, The name researchers give to the cultural system that occupied this territory had a geographic footprint that spanned those 90 kilometers of coastline and extended perhaps 30 to 40 kilometers inland along each valley. This is not a vast territory. Researchers including Jonathan Haas and Winifred Creamer have noted that the compact dimensions of this world meant that coordination and regular contact between settlements were practically achievable on foot. The valleys ran parallel to one another. The distances between them, across the desert ridges between river corridors, were substantial but not prohibitive. People moved within this landscape, and as they moved, they carried with them the materials, the knowledge, and the relationships that held the network together. What the survey work eventually established is that within this compact territory, approximately 30 distinct settlement sites were active during the same broad period, each one contributing something to the shared life of the region. The word civilization is sometimes used as though it implies a single unified city, a single seat of power, a single center from which everything else is organized. The Norte Chico evidence suggests something more distributed than that, a network of communities, each with its own mounds and plazas and organized spaces, each participating in a shared framework of exchange and ritual that extended across the four valleys without requiring a single administrative capital to coordinate it all. The site that researchers have identified as the dominant urban node within this system is Corral, located in the Supe Valley. Jonathan Haas and Winifred Creamer have characterized Corral as a primate center, a term used in settlement hierarchy analysis to describe the largest and most architecturally complex site within a regional system, the one whose scale and specialization distinguish it from the other settlements around it. Corral is larger than the other Norte Chico sites. Its platform mounds are more numerous and more substantial. The evidence of craft production and long-distance trade recovered from its excavations is more extensive than what has been found at the smaller valley settlements. In the language of regional survey archaeology, Corral is the center that the rest of the system bends toward, not a seat of conquest or military domination, but a place whose size and organizational complexity set it apart within the network it served. Standing at the base of Corral's principal mound and looking out across the Supe Valley, the scale of the surrounding landscape makes the network's logic easier to feel than any diagram can convey. The valley floor is narrow. The irrigated fields that would have produced the crops and fiber sustaining the city are visible as a green strip following the river. Beyond the green strip, the desert hills rise on both sides, pale and still. The city sits on a dry terrace above the river, positioned to overlook the fields and the water without being flooded by either. And somewhere beyond those hills, in the adjacent valleys to the north and south, other communities were building their own mounds and organizing their own fields and processing their own catches of fish, all of it part of the same regional fabric that Corral anchored, but did not wholly contain. The Patavilca Valley sits to the north of the Supe. It carries its own river to the Pacific, along a route similar to the Supes, cutting through the same pale coastal desert, flanked by the same dry hills. Archaeological survey work in the Patavilca Valley has identified settlement mounds rising from the valley floor, their shapes too regular to be natural erosion features, their positions consistent with the organizational logic of Norte Chico settlement patterns. From a hillside vantage point above the Patavilca, with the river catching late afternoon light below, a low mound is visible on the far bank among scrub vegetation. Its profile is soft. The scrub has colonized its lower slopes. Without knowing what to look for, a traveler on the hillside might read it as a natural feature of the valley, a gentle rise in the desert floor, unremarkable against the pale hills behind it. Knowing what to look for changes nothing about the mound's appearance. It remains a low shape in scrub vegetation on the far side of a river, but the knowledge of what it is, what it once contained, what its presence means for the understanding of this valley's history, makes it feel different, carries something inside it that the landscape does not yet fully reveal. Excavation reports from the Fortaleza Valley, the northernmost of the four Norte Chico river systems, show site plans drawn with solid lines for confirmed mound outlines and dashed lines for surveyed boundaries, still awaiting excavation. The scales on these drawings indicate sites roughly a third the size of Corral, substantial settlements, clearly organized around the same architectural principles as the Supe Valley sites, but smaller, less elaborately developed, belonging to the network without dominating it. The Fortaleza sites have not received the sustained archaeological attention that Corral has. Their mounds remain largely unexcavated. The record they hold is still largely sealed inside their own fill, waiting for the fieldwork that has not yet arrived. This is one of the features of the Norte Chico story that takes time to absorb. Carroll has been excavated and studied and published. Its dimensions are known. Its radiocarbon dates are established. Its architecture has been documented in detail. But the other settlements in the network, the smaller sites in the Patavilca and Fortaleza and Huara valleys, the coastal communities that participated in the exchange network, the intermediate settlements positioned between the inland agricultural centers and the coast, many of these remain only partly known. The circles on the survey map are real. The sites they mark are real. The sites they mark are real. But what those sites contain, what their full excavation might add to the understanding of how the Norte Chico network actually functioned, is still largely a question waiting on the fieldwork that will eventually answer it. The Huara Valley is the southernmost of the four. It runs parallel to the others, carrying its river from the high Andes through the coastal desert to the Pacific, its valley floor narrow and green against the surrounding pale. Survey work in the Huara has identified Norte Chico settlement sites there too, their mounds rising from the valley floor at positions consistent with access to irrigable land and to the trade routes that connected the four valleys. The Huara settlements are less well documented than those of the Supa Valley, less studied, their contributions to the regional system still being traced through the slow accumulation of survey and excavation data. They appear on the map as circles. Their presence confirms the geographic extent of the network. What they held and what role they played in the broader system is still in significant part a matter of ongoing research. What the survey work across all four valleys has established with reasonable confidence is that the Norte Chico network was broadly contemporaneous, that the settlements in the Fortaleza and Patavilca and Supe and Huara valleys were active at overlapping times, participating in the same regional exchange relationships during the same broad centuries. The radiocarbon dates from Corral, clustering around 2600 BCE, with some samples extending back toward 3000 BCE, place the height of Norte Chico's development in a period of world history that is worth holding in the mind for a moment, not because the comparison is alarming or competitive, but because the chronological coincidence is genuinely interesting in its own quiet way. The Old Kingdom of Egypt was building its most famous monuments during these same centuries. The Great Pyramid at Giza was constructed around 2560 BCE. The royal graves of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the administrative hierarchies, the temples and mortuary complexes, all of these were developing in the Nile Valley at the same time that Norte Chico communities were filling shikra bags with rubble and stacking them into platform mounds above the Supe River. In Mesopotamia, the city-states of the Tigris and Euphrates floodplain were organizing their own urban life, their own administrative systems, their own monumental construction programs in the same broad epoch. These three centers of complex early civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Norte Chico, were not in contact with one another. There is no evidence and no credible suggestion that ideas or technologies moved between them. Each one developed the forms of organization it developed from its own local conditions, its own particular environmental and social circumstances, following its own path through the same broad centuries. A photograph of the Giza Plateau taken from a distance shows the three pyramids rising from the desert, their triangular profiles familiar and still. A printed caption on such a photograph might note that these structures were under construction at the same time as Karal's Pyramide Mayor, 5,000 miles away on the other side of the world. The caption does not ask the photograph to bear any more weight than that. The pyramids were there. Caral was there. They did not know about each other. The world was larger and more separate in those centuries than it would later become. What this simultaneity suggests is not a mystery of hidden connection, but something perhaps more interesting, that the impulse toward organized, monumental civic life, toward the construction of large shared structures, and the development of complex regional exchange networks, arose independently in multiple places and in multiple environments during the same period of human history. The record does not explain why. It simply shows that it happened. Among the features of the Norte Chico archaeological record that researchers have returned to repeatedly, one of the most consistently remarked upon is an absence. Excavations at Caral and across the other Norte Chico sites have produced no caches of weapons. The skeletal remains recovered from Norte Chico sites do not show trauma patterns consistent with organized large-scale violence. No defensive walls have been identified encircling any Norte Chico settlement. No fortifications have been found positioning mounds or residential areas for military protection against an external threat. Jonathan Haas has drawn attention to this absence as a meaningful feature of the Norte Chico evidence. The argument he and other researchers have made is that Norte Chico's development as a complex civilization appears to have been organized primarily around economic interdependence and ritual authority, rather than around military force. The exchange relationships between inland agricultural communities and coastal fishing villages, the distribution of food and materials across the network, the shared architectural forms of the platform mounds and the sunken circular plazas, all of these represent forms of coordination and integration that did not require, or at least did not leave evidence of requiring, the coercive enforcement of military power. This is presented here as an observable archaeological fact, not as a political statement or a moral argument. The record is what the record is. What it shows is that Norte Chico's organizational complexity developed without the fortifications and weaponry that appear in other early complex societies. An excavation trench at a Norte Chico site, carefully screened for weapons or defensive hardware, finds that the hardware is not there. The screened sediment in the tray beside the trench contains bone fragments and plant remains, and the ordinary material of daily occupation. The field notebook entry documenting the absence is as factual as any other entry in the notebook. The absence is noted. The record moves on. It is worth sitting with the dimensions of what 30 settlements across 4 river valleys actually represents as a human achievement, not in the abstract language of civilization building, but in the concrete terms of what had to actually happen for that network to exist and function. Someone had to move between the valleys, Materials had to travel from coastal fishing settlements across the desert to inland agricultural centers, and agricultural products had to travel back the other way. The platform mounds at the inland sites could not have been built without a food surplus sufficient to support the labor involved in their construction, and that surplus, the research increasingly suggests, was underwritten by the protein supplied by coastal fish processing communities. None of this happened automatically. It required coordination. It required the maintenance of relationships between communities that were separated by desert terrain and connected by trade routes that had to be traveled on foot. The archaeological evidence for this coordination is physical. Marine shells recovered from inland Norte Chico sites far from the coast confirm that materials moved inland from the sea. Cotton textile fragments recovered from coastal sites confirm that inland-grown plant fiber moved in the other direction. The exchange is not hypothetical. It left material traces in the ground, and those traces have been recovered and documented. What the evidence does not show is exactly how the coordination was managed, what institutions or authorities or social relationships maintained the network's function over the centuries of its active life. The record shows the results of the coordination without fully revealing its mechanisms. This is the kind of gap in the archaeological record that repays patience rather than speculation. The evidence available establishes that coordination occurred. It establishes the scale and geographic range of the network. It establishes the materials that moved through it and the settlements that participated in it. What it has not yet established, and may not be able to establish from the physical record alone, is the full social logic by which a network of 30 communities across 4 river valleys maintained its coherence across multiple generations. That question remains open. It is a genuinely interesting question. The record holds it without urgency, a puzzle waiting on evidence rather than a secret waiting on revelation. In the dry season, when the rivers in the 4 Norte Chico valleys run low and the desert air is still and pale, the mounds of the smaller settlement sites sit in their valleys as they have sat for 5,000 years, their surfaces eroded, their interiors intact, their contents sealed by the same arid climate that preserved the shikra bags at Corral and the bone flutes recovered from the platform mound deposits. The desert is a good archivist. It does not decay organic material the way a wet environment would. It holds plant fiber and animal bone, and carbonized food remains in a condition that radiocarbon laboratories can still date and archaeobotanists can still identify. What was deposited in these mounds 5,000 years ago is still there, waiting in the same dry air that received it. The Patavilca Valley mound on the far bank of the river is still largely unexcavated. Its interior has not been opened. The research that would reveal its construction sequence, its radiocarbon dates, its artifact assemblages, its relationship to the broader Norte Chico network, none of that research has been conducted at this particular site in any comprehensive way. The mound sits in the scrub vegetation on the valley floor, its shape softening as the light changes, as afternoon moves toward dusk and the shadows lengthen across the valley. Across all 4 valleys, the survey map's 30 circles represent not just sites that have been identified, but a program of research still underway. Some of the sites have been excavated, some have been surveyed, but not excavated. Some are known from surface surveys that identified architectural features without opening the ground beneath them. The map circles are not all the same kind of knowledge. Some of them are confident identifications based on substantial field work. Others are preliminary identifications waiting on the detailed investigation that will either confirm or refine their place in the Norte Chico system. The survey is a living document in that sense, not finished, not settled, but accumulating accuracy as the research progresses. What the map shows already, even in its current form, is that Norte Chico was not Corral. Corral was the largest and most architecturally complex site in the network, the node around which the regional system organized itself most visibly. But the network was larger than Corral. It extended north into the Patavilca and Fortaleza valleys and south into the Huara. It included coastal settlements whose fisheries produced the protein that sustained the inland agricultural communities. It included smaller intermediate sites whose functions within the network have not yet been fully characterized. It was, in the terms available to the researchers who have spent decades surveying and excavating it, a genuinely regional civilization, not a city and its hinterland, but a network of communities distributed across an ecological landscape and organized around relationships of exchange and ritual that gave the whole system its coherence. There is something restful in the thought of a civilization that was complete in itself without being globally known. Norte Chico did not need an audience beyond its own valleys to be real. The people who built the mounds at Carroll and at the smaller Patavilca settlements and at the coastal fishing sites were not building for a record they imagined future researchers would one day compile. They were building for the purposes of their own community life, for the ritual requirements of the platform mound complexes, for the practical requirements of the exchange network, for the residential needs of the city's population, for whatever social and symbolic imperatives organized their collective existence. The civilization was complete on its own terms, without reference to the world that would one day discover it. The survey map on the field table, with its 30 circles in its 4 green river lines and its Pacific coastline along the left margin, represents a particular moment in the ongoing accumulation of that discovery. The fieldwork that produced the map took decades more fieldwork is underway. The unexcavated mounds in the Fortaleza and Patavilca and Huara valleys hold information that the existing record does not yet contain. The understanding of how Norte Chico worked, how its exchange network functioned, how its ritual life was organized, how its communities related to one another across the desert terrain between their valleys, will continue to be refined as that information is recovered. The 30 circles on the map are 30 separate containers of time. Each one holds inside it the physical remains of a community that participated in the Norte Chico world, its construction sequences, its artifact assemblages, its plant remains, and animal bones and organic materials available for dating. Some of those containers have been opened. Their contents have been studied and published and incorporated into the developing picture of what Norte Chico was. Others remain sealed. Their interiors are still exactly as they were when the last occupants of those settlements moved through them and left. The desert air has been doing its slow, patient work of preservation all this time, holding those interiors in the same condition that received them, waiting with no particular urgency for the researchers who will eventually arrive. The afternoon light drops slowly over the Norte Chico valleys. The rivers catch the last of it as the sun moves toward the western hills. The Pacific lies beyond those hills, invisible from the valley floors, but economically present in every dried fish that was ever carried inland from the coast, in every cotton bale that was ever carried outward toward the sea. The 4 valleys run parallel in the failing light, green in their lower courses, pale above the reach of irrigation, the hills rising dry and bare at their margins. The Patavilca mound sits in its scrub vegetation on the valley floor, its shape softening as the light drops. The shadow line moves across its surface, its profile gentles into the surrounding landscape, less distinct than it was an hour ago, its edges merging with the vegetation and the pale soil and the fading afternoon. From the hillside above the valley, the mound is still visible as a regular shape against the floor, too regular to be natural, its profile too even and consistent to be the product of erosion alone. But the light is going, and with the light the mound retreats from legibility, becoming once again the low shape in the valley that anyone who did not know what to look for might simply pass over. It is still unexcavated. It still holds whatever it holds inside. The Patavilca River moves below it in the last of the light, the water low in the dry season, the far bank quiet. The hills above the valley hold their color for a moment longer, the pale stone catching the last warm light before the sky goes to gray. The 30 circles on the survey map are still there, still numbered, still arranged across the 4 valleys on the piece of paper lying on the field table. The Pacific runs along the left margin. The Andean foothills press in from the right. Somewhere between those 2 boundaries, 30 communities once organized their collective life around the exchange of cotton and fish and the shared ritual of the platform mound, and the evidence of that organization sits in the ground of the 4 valleys, sealed in dry air, waiting with no particular urgency, holding its time inside. The Patavilca mound settles into the dusk. The scrub vegetation stills around it. The valley floor goes quiet in the cooling air. The mound is simply there, as it has been there, its shape sitting at the edge of the visible in the diminishing light, patient, contained, still holding whatever it holds, the valley going dark and still around it. In the lower fields of the Supe Valley, in the season when the cotton bolls open, the irrigated strip along the river runs pale and bright against the surrounding desert. The bolls split wide, their fiber catching the morning light. The canal alongside the nearest field carries water from the Supe River across ground that would otherwise be indistinguishable from the dry hillsides rising on either side. The same color, the same texture, the same flat refusal of anything living. The canal changes all of that. A narrow channel of stone-lined wall, perhaps 30 centimeters across, running the length of a field and then the next, and the water inside it slow and dark with distance traveled, and the cotton growing along its edge in a green strip that ends as sharply as a drawn line, where the irrigation stops and the desert begins again. The bolls here were not grown for eating. That distinction matters, and the physical record of the fields makes it quietly clear. The cotton cultivated in the lower Supe Valley during the period of Corral's occupation produced fiber, dense, workable, suited to spinning and weaving, and the archaeobotanical evidence recovered from the site confirms that fiber production, not food production, was what the inland agricultural communities directed their irrigated land toward. The fields fed an industry. The industry fed, in a way that the record shows was both practical and far-reaching, a network of communities whose combined activity made a city possible where the desert would otherwise have allowed nothing of the kind. The stone-lined canal walls are still visible in excavation trenches near Carl, the interior surfaces faintly stained in the way that stone is stained by long contact with moving water. The channels are small enough to step across. They are precise enough to have worked. In the field where the cotton grew, the canal ran along the edge, and the water drew across the soil in the controlled, purposeful way of a system that someone had planned and maintained and understood completely, not a river which follows the shape of the land and does not ask permission, but an engineered thing, a decision made in stone and sustained across seasons and generations. The water moved where the canal directed it. The cotton grew where the water reached. The fiber was gathered when the bowls opened, and what happened to it afterward is the part of the story that the record makes visible at both ends of the transaction, in the cotton fields of the inland valleys and in the cold, rich waters of the Pacific coast, many kilometers to the west. The Humboldt Current runs along the western edge of South America with a reliable and particular character. Cold water from the deep ocean wells up along the Peruvian coast, carrying nutrients from below the surface into the shallower, warmer water near shore. The result is one of the most productive marine environments in the world, measured not in species diversity, but in sheer biomass, dense populations of anchovies and sardines that have sustained human communities along this coastline for as long as those communities have existed. The Norte Chico coastal settlements occupied precisely this zone. The evidence of what they did with it is preserved in the organic record recovered from their sites. The bones, the scales, the dried and processed remains of fish caught in nets from boats or from shore, and then prepared for transport inland. The nets that coastal communities used to harvest those fish were made from cotton. That connection, the cotton fields of the inland valleys, supplying the fiber for the nets used by coastal fishing villages, is not speculative reconstruction. The physical evidence recovered from Norte Chico sites along the coast includes woven cotton fishing net fragments, the fiber identified by laboratory analysis as belonging to the same cotton variety cultivated in the inland Supe Valley. The net fragment lies on a conservation table, its mesh still intact enough to count the individual knots, each one tied in the same practical pattern that a fisherman's hands would make when the goal is strength and speed rather than display. The fiber itself is pale and dry after thousands of years of preservation in the coastal environment, but the laboratory record of what it is made from and where that material came from is clear. The cotton traveled from the irrigated fields near the Supe River to the coast. The nets were made from it, the fish were caught with it, and then the fish came back. That return journey, dried anchovy and sardine, processed at the coast and carried inland along routes the record does not specify precisely, but the physical evidence confirms absolutely, is the other half of an exchange relationship that the record shows running through the entire Norte Chico network. Excavations at Coral have recovered carbonized fish remains from storage contexts near residential structures, the scales still faintly visible in excavation photographs, the assemblage organic and ceramic-free and quietly specific in what it implies, that a city sitting in the middle of a coastal desert with no direct access to the sea was regularly receiving high-protein marine food from communities that did. The dried fish in that storage room did not arrive there by accident. It arrived as part of a structured and sustained exchange. The storage room itself is a small space, its floor covered with the carbonized remains of what was once a significant delivery of processed fish. The walls around it are low stone, the construction modest. The room is not the most architecturally distinguished space at Coral, and that ordinariness is perhaps the point. This is not a ceremonial deposit, not a ritual offering, not an elite cache of imported prestige goods. It is food, stored food, brought from the coast by the communities that caught and dried it, delivered to a city that had cotton fiber to offer in return. The excavation photographs show the floor layer in cross-section, the organic material dark against the lighter surrounding soil, the fish scales catching what light the excavation lamps throw across them. A practical room, a practical transaction, the kind of arrangement that sustains a city from year to year without requiring anything more than the continuing movement of goods between communities that each produce what the other needs. That reciprocal logic, cotton inland, fish at the coast, both moving toward each other through the exchange network, is what researchers examining the Norte Chico record have identified as the economic engine underlying the entire system. Corral did not build its pyramid mayor by hoarding resources extracted from unwilling neighbors. The record does not suggest coercion, and the evidence of what the inland and coastal communities produced and exchanged suggests something more like a mutually reinforcing arrangement, each side dependent on the other in a way that gave the relationship its stability. The inland farming communities needed marine protein. The coastal fishing communities needed cotton fiber for their nets. Both communities needed, or at least were part of, a regional network that included a ceremonial and administrative center large enough to organize, store, and redistribute the surplus that the exchange generated. The cotton fields in the lower Supi Valley also produced, alongside the industrial crop, a more varied agricultural yield that the archaeobotanical record at Carl documents clearly. Squash was cultivated in the irrigated fields, and beans and guava, food plants suited to the warm, dry climate of the valley, when water from the Sup River was available to them. The evidence of squash seeds and bean fragments appears in the sorted plant, remains from Corral's excavation trenches, separated into labeled compartments on the archaeobotanist's sorting tray, identified and counted. The guava, a fruit that grows reliably in the Supa Valley's climate, given sufficient water, adds another dimension to the agricultural picture, a cultivated food source that supplemented the marine protein arriving from the coast and the starchy bulk provided by beans and squash grown in the valley's own fields. The sorting tray from a corral excavation tells a quiet and specific story when examined carefully. The compartments hold squash seeds in one section, bean fragments in another, and in the corner of the tray, where maize would appear if the community had been cultivating it in meaningful quantities, the record is nearly empty. The notation in pencil alongside that near-empty section, maize, a question mark, and a count close enough to 0 to be functionally absent, is one of the more significant small observations in the entire Norte Chico research record. Earlier models of complex civilization in the Americas had made corn agriculture a precondition for the kind of social organization that builds platform mounds and sunken plazas, and an exchange network spanning 4 river valleys. The sorting tray at Carl suggests that model needs revision. Carl's population sustained itself and its monumental building program without maize as a meaningful dietary staple. The fish did the work that corn was supposed to do. The system was not less sophisticated for being unexpected. It was simply different from what the prevailing framework had predicted. The irrigated fields along the Supi River were not by the measure of the desert surrounding them, a large agricultural zone. The valley is narrow. The ribbon of cultivable land along the river is constrained on both sides by dry hillsides that the irrigation canals could not practically reach. What the fields could produce was limited by the river's volume and the canal system's capacity, and the crops that grew there were chosen accordingly. Cotton for the coastal nets, squash and beans and guava for local consumption. The whole agricultural effort concentrated into a strip of irrigated land that made as much as it could from the water available to it. The canal walls that lined those fields are still recoverable in excavation trenches near the site, the stone-lined channels intact, the interior surfaces still carrying that faint dark stain of long contact with slow-moving water. The canals are narrow, they are precise, they are the physical infrastructure of a food system that worked demonstrably and for a long time without the crop that everyone expected to find at the center of it. The coastal communities that supplied Carol with dried fish were, in the terms of the Norte Chico exchange network, as essential to the system as the inland farming settlements. The cold water of the Humboldt Current off the Peruvian coast does not offer a gentle or predictable harvest. The anchovy populations that sustained the coastal villages were, as they remain today, subject to the periodic disruptions of El Niño events that warm the surface water and drive the fish to deeper, colder zones. In the years when the anchovies and sardines were abundant, the coastal communities could catch and process and dry and transport large quantities of high-protein food inland. In the years when the current shifted and the fish moved away, the coastal villages would have depended more heavily on whatever the inland communities could offer in return for the cotton fiber the coastal nets were made from. The record does not give a detailed account of how the Norte Chico network managed those fluctuations, but the structure of the exchange, two kinds of community, each producing something the other needed, connected by a trading relationship that moved goods regularly between them, is the kind of arrangement that buffers the participants against the worst of what any single bad season could bring to either end of the chain. The marine shells recovered from inland Norte Chico sites far from the coast are another entry in the physical record of this exchange. Shell is durable in ways that fish remains are not, and its presence at inland sites provides a material trace of the coastal connection that is preserved even when organic food remains have not survived. A shell found far from the water that produced it is evidence of transport and exchange, a small object that carries the distance it traveled in its own composition, recoverable by the researchers who analyze what it is and where it came from. The Norte Chico sites have produced this kind of evidence across the inland valleys, non-local materials that did not arrive by accident, that required the movement of people or goods between communities at sufficient scale and regularity to leave a pattern in the archaeological record. The pattern itself, accumulated across excavation sites in the Supi Valley and the other Norte Chico valleys, is what supports the characterization of the network as genuinely integrated, not simply a collection of nearby settlements that happen to produce different things, but communities connected by a regular and structured exchange that made each of them part of a larger economic whole. Carroll sits near the center of that picture, its size and architectural complexity suggesting a role in the regional system that went beyond simply consuming what the coastal villages produced and sending cotton fiber in the other direction. The evidence of specialized craft production at Corral and the sheer scale of the construction program that the site represents implies the management of labor and material at a level that a simple village-to-village trade would not generate by itself. Something coordinated the flow. The platform mounds in the sunken plazas that rose in the Supi Valley over the centuries of Corral's occupation were not built on the surplus of a single community's agriculture alone. They were built on the surplus of a regional exchange network that in its own terms and on its own scale had found a way to produce more than any of its individual participants could have generated in isolation. The cotton bolls opening in the lower Supi Valley fields are the most visible entry point into that network, a crop that does not feed the people growing it, that makes no sense as an agricultural choice unless there is somewhere for the fiber to go and something to receive in return. The canal that waters those fields is narrow and precise. The stone lining its walls has been in the ground for nearly 5,000 years. The water that ran through it is gone, but the channel is still readable in the excavation trench as a decision about where water should go and what should grow there and what should flow in the other direction once the harvest was gathered and spun and woven into the nets that coastal hands would knot into shape and drag through cold Pacific water heavy with anchovies. The fish that came back inland from those nets traveled a considerable distance. The Supi Valley runs approximately 30 to 40 kilometers from the coast to the inland hills, and Corral sits along that route in a position that places it neither at the coast nor deep in the Andean foothills, a middling elevation, a crossroads of sorts, its dry terrace above the river, accessible from both directions and positioned to receive what moved along the valley floor. The dried fish that ended up on the floor of the storage room near a Corral residential structure had traveled the full length of that route, processed and dried at the coast by the communities who caught it, transported inland by people whose names and routes the record does not preserve, but whose activity is confirmed by what they left behind. The storage room is small, the floor layer is dark, the fish scales are faint and particular in the excavation photographs, specific enough to confirm species, specific enough to confirm origin, specific enough to say with confidence that what the room contained was dried anchovy and sardine, the same fish caught in cotton nets in the same cold current water that the Humboldt Current drives along the Peruvian coast today. The room smelled of the sea. It is possible to say that plainly, because dried anchovy has a smell that is distinctive and persistent, and that would have filled a small stone room entirely. The city that contained that room was built in a desert, on a dry terrace above a river, surrounded by barren hills and open sky, and the pale sameness of the coastal desert in every direction the eye could travel. The sea was not visible from Corral. The sea was not within walking distance of a comfortable afternoon, but the sea was present in that room in the scales of fish that had been caught in nets made from cotton grown in the fields below the city and transported back along the route the valley provided, folded into the ordinary storage of a household in a city that could not have existed without it. That particular quality of the evidence, the ordinary room, the practical deposit, the absence of anything ceremonial or unusual in the context of the find, is what makes the Norte Chico exchange relationship feel real in a way that architectural analysis alone does not. The platform mounds at Corral are impressive at a scale that requires effort to comprehend. The pyramid mare's volume, the estimate of how many cubic meters of fill material its construction required, the shikra bags packed with rubble and stacked inside its framework, these are facts that imply a social organization large and coordinated enough to accomplish something genuinely enormous. But the scale of the mounds is abstract in the way that large numbers are abstract. The storage room floor is not abstract. It is a small, specific, physical thing, a deposit of dried fish on a stone floor, preserved by the same desert air that preserved the shikra bags in the mound walls, recoverable by excavation, readable in photographs, identifiable by the species of the fish and the cultivation history of the cotton that the nets that caught them were made from. The sorting tray with its compartments of squash seeds and bean fragments and the near-empty maize section is similarly concrete, a physical object from a working excavation, its contents organized and labeled by an archaeobotanist whose job is to count and identify and record without imposing a narrative on the results. The narrative that emerges from the sorting tray is not dramatic. It says, this community ate squash. It ate beans. It ate guava when the trees bore fruit. It ate fish brought from the coast. It did not eat corn in any quantity that the plant remains record could detect. That is all the tray says, and it says it quietly, in the language of seeds and fragments, sorted into compartments and annotated with pencil marks that do not reach for significance beyond what the contents actually contain. The irrigation canal says something similarly quiet and similarly specific. It says water was directed here deliberately. The stone-lined walls say The direction of water was considered important enough to build a durable system for it. The faint dark stain on the interior walls says water ran here for long enough to leave a mark. The cotton that grew beside the canal, and the net fragment recovered from the coast, and the fish remains on the storage room floor. Each of these is a separate, specific, physical thing, preserved by the same arid conditions that preserved everything else at Corral and across the Norte Chico sites. Each one is a point in a pattern. The pattern is the exchange network. The exchange network is the foundation of the city. The city is the platform mounds and the sunken plazas, and the residential structures, with their modest stone walls, and the bone flutes buried in ceremonial context, and the knotted cord objects recovered from the excavation layers. All of it rests, ultimately, on the cotton in the lower fields, and the fish in the cold water off the coast, and the canal that carried river water from one place to the other, and the routes between communities that moved goods and sustained a regional system across the centuries of Corral's occupation. The archaeobotanical record from Corral and the other Norte Chico sites has been assembled from excavations conducted over many years. The plant remains recovered through careful screening of excavated soil, each sample sorted and identified and counted and integrated into a growing picture of what these communities grew and ate and produced. The picture is not complete. The record has gaps where organic material did not survive, or where excavation has not yet reached, or where the sample sizes are too small to draw confident conclusions. The sorting tray with its pencil annotations carries those gaps honestly. The question mark beside the maze entry is not a failure of the research. It is the research doing what careful research does, which is to distinguish between what has been found and what has not, and to mark the difference clearly. The cotton crop fits into that picture without ambiguity. The evidence for its cultivation in the inland Norte Chico valleys is established in the archaeobotanical record, and the evidence for its use in coastal fishing nets is established in the material recovered from coastal sites. The movement of cotton fiber from the inland fields to the coastal communities, and the movement of dried fish from the coast back to the inland settlements is the documented core of the exchange relationship. The non-local shells and fish remains recovered from inland Norte Chico sites and the cotton net fragments recovered from coastal sites provide the physical anchors that the interpretation rests on. The exchange is not inferred from architectural similarity or cultural affiliation alone. It is documented in the objects themselves, in what they are made from and where they ended up. The guava trees that grew in the irrigated fields of the Supe Valley are a quieter presence in the record than the cotton or the fish, but they are there, identified in the archaeobotanical material from Carroll, a fruit tree suited to the valley's climate when water is available, contributing to the agricultural system alongside the industrial crop and the food plants that the community depended on for its daily nutritional needs. Guava grows well in warm, dry environments with reliable irrigation. The Supe Valley, given the canal system that directed river water across the cultivable land, was precisely that kind of environment. The trees that produced fruit in the irrigated zone would have been a consistent and valued part of the food supply, their cultivation requiring less management than the cotton or the beans, but contributing something sweet and high in vitamin content to a diet built largely around dried fish and starchy legumes. The fruit does not survive in the archaeological record the way that seeds and carbonized remains do, but the archaeobotanical evidence of guava cultivation at Corral is present in what the plant does leave behind, identifiable material that the excavation and laboratory process recovers and places in the sorting tray alongside everything else. In the lower Supe Valley, in the irrigated strip along the river. The fields that grew all of this are quiet now, neither fully excavated nor fully studied, their surface showing the same dry, pale coloring as the surrounding desert, where the irrigation no longer reaches them. The canal walls are buried, the cotton bolls are long gone. The fish that traveled up the valley in the other direction are preserved only in the excavation record of the sites they reached, in the carbonized organic layer on a storage room floor, in the faint glint of scales in an excavation photograph. The exchange that sustained a city for 1,000 years or more left its evidence in both directions, in the fields at one end of the valley and in the storage rooms at the other, in the net fragments on the coast and the non-local shells found far inland, in the sorting tray with its seeds and fragments and its honest pencil annotation marking the absence of what was expected and was not found. The storage room at the base of the corral residential structure is small enough that the entire floor is visible in a single excavation photograph. The dark organic layer covers it completely. The fish scales catch the light of the excavation lamp at an angle that makes them visible against the surrounding carbonized material, faint and particular and specific to their species, preserved by the same desert dryness that preserved everything else at Carroll across the intervening millennia. It is a small room. It held food. The food came from the sea. The sea was far away across the desert and the dry coastal hills, in cold Pacific water that the Humboldt Current keeps rich enough to support the anchovies and sardines that coastal communities caught in cotton nets, woven from fiber grown in fields, irrigated by water drawn from a river in a valley where a city sat on a dry terrace above the water and organized, in ways the record confirms without fully specifying, the exchange that made all of it work. The room smelled of the sea, and the city around it was built in a desert, and the canal that carried the water to the cotton fields ran narrow and precise along the edge of the irrigated strip, and the water that ran through it left a dark stain on the stone walls that the excavation photographs show clearly, still there, still readable, after nearly 5,000 years of desert air. On a long conservation table in a climate-controlled room in Lima, 32 bone flutes are laid out in a row. The largest is at the left, the smallest is at the right. Between them, the sizes diminish by increments, so gradual that from a few steps away the row seems almost to taper like a single continuous object, a pale line drawn across the dark cloth beneath it. Each flute was made from the bone of a condor or a pelican. Each one was cleaned, hollowed, and cut with finger holes spaced at deliberate intervals. The holes are small and precise, worn smooth at their edges from use, and in the examination room's careful overhead light, they cast shadows no larger than a fingernail. The room around the flutes is quiet. There are no windows. The air is held at a steady temperature and a steady humidity, the kind of controlled stillness designed to slow time down for the things stored inside it. A conservation technician documented each flute individually before the row was assembled: length, diameter, the number and position of the finger holes, the condition of the bone surface, the color of the mineral staining along the shaft. That documentation is a file now, a set of measurements, a record of 32 objects that were placed in the ground together sometime around 5,000 years ago and found together in a single excavation context during Ruth Shady Solis's work at Carroll in the Supe Valley of Peru. They were not scattered, they were not discarded, they were deposited, which in the language of archaeology means they were placed with intention in a ceremonial context, arranged or bundled in a way that suggested they belonged together and were meant to remain together, whether they were buried at the end of their use or offered at the beginning of a construction phase, or sealed into the mound as a permanent gift, the record does not say with certainty. What the context establishes is that someone gathered these 32 instruments and set them down in that place, and that the place was not ordinary. The smallest flute is no longer than a spread hand. Its finger holes are correspondingly close together, spaced for small fingers or for a register of sound higher than what the larger instruments could reach. In an ensemble, the 32 flutes together would have covered a wide range of pitch. The bones used, condor femur, pelican bone, suggest that the makers selected materials not only for their workability, but perhaps for their associations, since condors in the Andean world carried meanings that connected the living to realms above ordinary experience. Whether those associations were at work in the minds of Carrel's flute makers is a question the record leaves open. What the record shows is that the holes were cut carefully, that the instruments were played. The wear on the finger holes makes that plain enough, and that they were considered important enough, or sacred enough, or simply loved enough to be gathered and placed together at the end of whatever ritual life they had sustained. The row on the conservation table holds that history in its silence across the Supe Valley sites that Ruth Shady Solis and her colleagues excavated over many years. The evidence of ritual practice accumulates in ways that are specific and unhurried. The platform mounds at Carrel are not simply monuments, they are stratified records, each construction phase sealed over an earlier one. And within those sealed layers, excavators have found formal deposits of burnt material, charred plant remains, animal bones. These are not the residue of cooking or of ordinary domestic fire. They occur in niches cut into interior walls. They occur on prepared surfaces. They occur within construction fills that were sealed deliberately when a new building phase began, entombing the offerings within the growing mass of the mound itself. The burnt deposits are small. A niche might hold a handful of charred material, a few bones, the ash of something botanical. The scale is intimate rather than spectacular, which is in some ways more telling, because intimacy in ritual suggests regularity, not the fire of an exceptional occasion, but the fire of a practice embedded in the ordinary rhythm of life at Carrel, repeated in generation after generation until the deposits accumulated into a visible stratigraphy of belief. The precise nature of those beliefs is not recoverable. Archaeology can document the form and the location and the materials of a ritual deposit. It cannot recover the words spoken over the fire or the particular meaning assigned to the burning. What the corral deposits establish is that fire-based ceremony was standardized across the Norte Chico region, which means it was shared, transmitted, maintained, recognized as the same kind of act across different communities separated by river valleys and miles of coastal desert. Standardization implies communication. It implies that the people of these communities understood themselves to be participating in something they held in common. The platform mounds themselves may have served as one of the primary mechanisms for that shared understanding. Architectural analysis of the mounds at Corral has identified orientations that appear consistent with alignments to significant solar events. Staircase orientations and summit platform positions at several mounds seem to have been positioned in relation to the rising or setting sun at the solstices and equinoxes, those moments in the annual calendar when the sun reaches the outermost points of its arc and then begins its return. The orientations are not uniform across every structure, and the analysis involves degrees of inference that the researchers themselves are careful to note. But the pattern where it appears suggests that the builders of Corral's mounds were attentive to the sky in a structured way, that the annual movement of the sun was something that architecture was designed to mark and perhaps to frame. A platform mound whose staircase faces the point on the eastern horizon where the sun rises at the winter solstice becomes, at that moment in the year, a kind of instrument, a fixed stone pointer that confirms for everyone watching that the sky is behaving as expected, that the year has turned, that the light is beginning its long return. The confirmatory power of that moment would have been considerable for a community whose agricultural cycle depended on knowing when the seasons were changing. Whether that was among the intended functions of the alignment, whether the builders thought of it in those terms, is not something the record can answer. The orientations are documented. Their implications remain a question held at a careful distance, interesting precisely because it has not been resolved. Below the platform mounds, at their bases, the sunken circular plazas open in the other direction. Where the mounds rise, the plazas descend. They are semi-subterranean, cut or built into the ground so that the floor lies below the level of the surrounding surface, enclosed by curved retaining walls that complete the circle and hold the space apart from everything outside it. Photographed from the rim of one of these plazas, looking down and inward, the floor is wide and swept and empty. The walls curve around in both directions and meet behind the viewer. The mound staircase rises directly ahead, climbing toward the platform above. The relationship between the sunken plaza and the mound it faces is one of the most consistently repeated spatial arrangements at Corral and across Norte Chico sites. The pairing, the descent of the plaza against the ascent of the mound, created a kind of dialogue in stone between two registers of communal experience. The plaza holds many people at ground level or below it, oriented toward the mound. The mound lifts whatever occurred on its summit above the gathered assembly below. Researchers have interpreted the plazas as inclusive spaces designed to accommodate large numbers of people in a shared act of witness or participation. The evidence for this interpretation is architectural rather than textual, because Carroll left no written records in any form that has been identified and read. The dimensions of the plazas support the interpretation. They are large enough to hold substantial gatherings. The orientation confirms it. Every sunken plaza is arranged in deliberate relationship to the mound it faces, and the distribution of these paired structures across the site suggests that the pairing was not incidental, but fundamental to how Carroll organized its collective life. In the plazas, people gathered. On the mounds, something was performed or displayed or offered. Fire, music, ceremony of one kind or another, visible to those below. The bone flutes may have sounded across that space. The smoke of burnt offerings may have risen from the summit platforms into the still desert air. The gathered people in the plazas may have heard and watched from the enclosure of those curved walls, oriented together toward whatever was happening above them. This is the architecture of a shared experience, deliberately constructed, that the architecture still stands, that the plazas still hold their circular shape, and the mounds still rise above them after 5,000 years of wind and sun, and the occasional violence of Andean seismic events is a consequence of the desert. The Supe Valley receives almost no rainfall. The materials that might have decayed in a wetter climate, the woven shikra bags inside the mounds, the plant fiber of the offerings, the organic deposits in the sealed niches, were preserved instead, held in a state of near-perfect desiccation that functions as a kind of unintentional archive. Carroll did not mean to keep its records. It simply built in a place where the air was dry enough that the records kept themselves. Among those records, one object sits apart from all the others, not in size, not in age, but in the particular kind of openness it carries. In a conservation facility in Lima, On a dark cloth on an examination table, a small assemblage of cotton cord rests in the arrangement in which it was found. There is a primary cord, thicker than the pendants attached to it, from which thinner cords of varying lengths hang at intervals. Each pendant cord bears knots. Some cords bear several, some fewer, spaced at positions along the cord's length that do not appear to be random. The fiber is pale, it is dry, it is cotton, identified by laboratory analysis as the same cultivated variety that the farming communities of the Supe Valley grew in their irrigated fields. This object was recovered from Carroll during Ruth Shady Solis's excavations. Its identification as a quipu, the knotted cord device that became one of the most distinctive technologies of the later Andean world, and which the Inca used for record keeping and communication at imperial scale, is a characterization that researchers have advanced and that has been published in scholarly literature while also remaining the subject of ongoing discussion within the field. The identification has not been universally settled. Whether the Carroll object functions as a quipu in the same way that Inca quipus function, whether it encodes information in the same kinds of systems, is a question that the scholarly conversation has not closed. What can be said with confidence is this: the object is a primary cord-bearing pendant, cords bearing knots, which is the structural description of a quipu, and it comes from a site whose occupation dates to roughly 5,000 years ago. If the identification holds, it would place the origins of knotted cord recording not in the Inca period, not in the centuries before the Spanish arrived, but at the very foundation of complex society in the Andes, at the same moment as the platform mounds and the sunken plazas and the bone flutes, all of it arising together as part of whatever it meant to build a city in the Supa Valley at the beginning of the third millennium before the Common Era. The Inca quipu is one of the most intensively studied objects in Andean archaeology, and it is still not fully understood. The knots encode numerical information in positional systems based on decimal counting, but the question of whether quipup encoded only numbers or also narrative, phonetic, or linguistic information, whether they were records or texts or something that has no exact analogy in the written traditions of other cultures, is a question that scholars are still actively working through. Some quipup appear to encode more than quantities. The full range of what the system could carry remains an open problem. The Carroll object adds another layer of openness to that already open question. If the knotted cords from Carroll represent an early form of the same tradition, then the tradition is far older than the Inca, far older, in fact, than anything the Inca themselves seem to have known about its origins. The Andean practice of recording by knotting cord would reach back not centuries but millennia, through the Wari, through the Tiwanaku, through cultures and peoples whose names are not in any written record, down to a moment when a community of people in a desert valley above the Pacific built platform mounds and gathered in circular plazas, and apparently also tied knots in cotton cord in patterns they considered worth keeping. The knots on the Carroll object are still tight. The pattern is still intact. The pendant cords still hang in the arrangement they held when someone last touched them. 5,000 years have passed. The knots have not loosened. What the knots say, what they were intended to record or communicate or preserve, is still folded inside the fiber. This is not an unsettling fact. It is a patient one. Scholarship moves through open questions the way excavation moves through soil, carefully, with the understanding that the answer may be in the next layer, or may require a different instrument, or may, in the end, require a question better phrased than the ones currently being asked. The Corral Quipu does not demand resolution. It simply sits on its dark cloth in the conservation facility, the pendant cords hanging in the same quiet order, and waits for the field to develop the means to read it. Outside that room, the world above Corral goes on in its familiar way. The Supe Valley receives almost no rain. The desert hills above the terrace where the city stands are the same pale color they have always been, the color of dry rock, of mineral dust, of a landscape that has been almost unchanged since the platform mounds were first built above the river. The Supe River moves along its course through the valley floor, a thin green line through the otherwise bare ground. The same river whose water the irrigation canals once carried to the cotton fields, the same water that made the farming possible, that made the surplus possible, that made the city possible in the first place. The 6 major platform mounds still rise above the terrace. The Pyramid Mayor, the largest of them, is roughly 18 meters tall, not tall by the measures of other ancient monuments, but solid and broad, a presence in the landscape that does not require height to establish itself. Its base covers a footprint of approximately 150 by 160 meters, a mass of quarried rubble packed into woven shikra bags and stacked by the hands of workers whose names were not recorded and whose individual lives left no trace. The archaeology has been able to recover. The bags are still inside the mound, as they have been for 5,000 years. The rush fibers dry and compressed, the knots holding the mouths of the bags closed with a tightness that the desert air has preserved without alteration. The knots on the shikra bags, the knots on the quipu cords. There is a particular quality to the knots at Carroll, to the idea that so much of what the site has been kept because something was tied shut against loss, bound against time, held in a shape that the dry air then maintained. A shikra bag filled with rubble and tied at the neck is a purely practical object. A quipu cord knotted at measured intervals is something else, something whose relationship to meaning is at least intended, even if the meaning itself has not yet been recovered. But both involve the same act, the tying of a knot, the closing of a loop, the decision to hold something in a fixed arrangement rather than let it drift apart. Corral has held many things in fixed arrangements for a very long time. The flutes in their row, the burnt offerings in their niches, the shikra bags in their mound walls, the knotted cords in the conservation facility, the sunken plazas in their circles, the mound staircases facing the horizon, all of it still in the arrangement it was given, still holding the shape of whatever decision was made about where to put it and how to keep it together. To stand at the base of the Pyramid Mayor and look up its slope, to do this not as a casual visitor, but with the slow attention of someone who has followed the record this far, is to become aware of the particular weight carried by the phrase 5,000 years. The phrase is used often enough in discussions of ancient places that it can pass through the mind without registering as a duration, but at Corral, where the site has been excavated carefully enough that specific dates are attached to specific layers, the phrase becomes something more than a figure of speech. The radiocarbon dates returned from the organic materials inside these mounds, the plant fiber, the burnt offerings, the shikra bags themselves, cluster around 2600 BCE, with some samples reaching back to 3000 BCE. In approximately 2560 BCE, the Great Pyramid at Giza was nearing completion across an ocean and a continent away, in a civilization that had no knowledge of what was being built in the Supe Valley, just as the builders of the Supe Valley's mounds had no knowledge of what was rising above the Egyptian desert. Two separate human experiments in monumental construction, urban organization, and the concentration of collective labor into permanent stone, running simultaneously, independently, with no evidence of contact between them. This parallel is not a mystery in the sense of being unexplained. It has a straightforward interpretation. Human communities, when they reach a certain scale and organizational complexity, tend to build upward. They tend to create permanent structures that mark their collective identity and organize their shared life around a civic center. The form recurs because the pressures that produce it recur: the need for coordination, the need for ritual cohesion, the need for a place that is understood to belong to everyone and to no one, private individual, a center that the community can orient around. That Norte Chico reached this point at the same time as Egypt and Mesopotamia, and without the ceramic technology that archaeologists had long assumed was a prerequisite for such development, does not mean that the two traditions were secretly connected, or that there is a missing piece of history somewhere linking them. It means that the old model was missing something. The old model assumed that pottery came before monuments, that ceramic production was a reliable marker of the social complexity required for urban organization. Corral demonstrated, with radiocarbon dates and excavated platform mounds, that the model was incomplete. No ceramics in the surface material. Monumental construction beginning around 3,000 years before the Common Era. The evidence was simply incompatible with the assumption, and the assumption had to give way. This is how knowledge moves, not through sudden revelation, but through the patient accumulation of evidence that eventually makes a prior model untenable. Paul Kosuk photographed the Supe Valley mounds from the air in the 1940s and did not recognize them as a major prehistoric site because the professional tools available for recognizing such a thing were not yet adequate to the task. For decades, survey archaeologists passed through the region and noted the mounds without excavating them, because the absence of ceramics on the surface told them, within the framework they were using, that there was nothing significant to find. Ruth Shady Solis looked at the same mounds in 1994 and saw something worth digging into, and what emerged from that digging remade the understanding of when and how civilization developed in the Western Hemisphere. The mounds were always there. The river was always there. The dry terrace above the valley, the pale hills, the thin green line of vegetation following the water toward the sea, all of it was always exactly as it is now. What changed was not the place, but the capacity to read it. The bone flutes from the ceremonial deposit were silent in the earth for 5,000 years, and then they were found, cleaned, measured, laid in a row on a conservation table. The burnt offerings in the sealed niches were dark and compressed in their plaster-walled enclosures for 5,000 years, and then an excavation trowel opened the surface above them, and they were documented, sampled, recorded. The cotton cords with their pattern of knots were folded into the dry earth of the Supe Valley and held there, undisturbed, until a careful hand lifted them into the light. The things that were tied shut held, the things that were sealed held. What remains open is what it all meant, not the what of it, which is documented in careful excavation reports and published radiocarbon studies, and the records of the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos, and in the archives of the scholars who have spent years on this ground. But the inside of the meaning, the name of the practice performed on the mound summit, the words spoken, if there were words, the significance of the condor bones chosen for the flutes, whether that choice was practical or symbolic, whether it was both, whether the distinction between practical and symbolic had any meaning for the people who made them, the content of the knotted cords, if they carry content in a linguistic sense at all, the name of the city, if there was a name. No text survives to answer any of this. There may never be a text that answers it. The Norte Chico civilization, as far as the record shows, developed its organizational complexity and its monumental architecture and its long-distance economic network and its ritual traditions without producing anything in a script that can be read. The quipus, if they are quipus, may encode information, but the encoding system for the Carol object has not been recovered, and there is no equivalent of the Rosetta Stone waiting in a Peruvian archive to unlock it. The silence is complete in that register, and it is a particular kind of silence, not the silence of destruction, not the silence of a record that was once readable and was then lost or burned or suppressed, but the silence of a civilization that either did not use written records in any form we have yet recognized, or used records in forms that were organic and have not survived, or encoded its communications in the knotted chords and the architectural orientations and the standardized ritual forms that the archaeology recovers only in their physical dimensions, not in their meaning. What the record does show is this, that something organized and coherent and lasting was built in the Supe Valley and in the 3 river valleys around it. That it was built without weapons, without fortifications, without the skeletal evidence of mass violence that appears so consistently in the records of other early complex societies. That it was sustained for centuries by a practical and apparently functional exchange between inland farmers and coastal fishing communities, each producing something the other needed, the whole system supporting a surplus that could be directed toward monument building and specialized labor and ritual production. That it involved music, that it involved fire, that it involved gathering in shared spaces oriented toward a common center, that the buildings it produced are still standing, and the objects it made are still being recovered, and the questions it poses to the scholarship that studies it are still open and still worth asking. The conservation room in Lima is quiet at this hour. The 32 bone flutes lie in their row, the largest at the left, the smallest at the right, the bone surfaces pale under the examination light, the finger holes casting their small shadows. They are as they were when they were placed on the cloth, arranged, ordered, held in a specific relationship to one another that someone thought mattered. The condor bone that makes the longest flute is light and hollow, the kind of bone that evolved for flight, repurposed here for something that also moves through air, sound. Like a bone is hollow in the middle, it is defined by what it travels through and what receives it. The sound these flutes made, whatever it was, whatever scales or intervals or rhythms the players used, whatever it meant in the context of the ceremonies performed on the mound, summits, and in the plazas of Corral, left no physical record. It moved through the air of the Supa Valley 5,000 years ago and dissipated, as all sound does, into the landscape around it. What remains is the instrument, the shape of the sound's container, the finger holes that shaped what was possible, the bone walls that gave the sound its particular color, the care taken in the cutting, and the finishing that suggests these objects were made with full attention by someone who knew exactly what they were making and why it mattered. The row is still on the table. The room is still quiet. The lights above hold steady. Somewhere outside the building, Lima is going about its night. The streets, the harbor, the long coast running north toward the Supe Valley, toward the dry terrace above the river, toward the platform mounds, standing in the dark above the place where the cotton fields were. The pyramid mayor does not look like much from a distance. In photographs, in the middle of the day, it looks like a hill that has been shaped by something, its sides too regular for purely natural erosion, its flat top too deliberate for an accident of geology. At dusk, the profile changes. The flat summit and the stepped sides catch the last horizontal light, and the mound becomes unambiguous, clearly made, clearly intentional, clearly the work of many hands over many years. The fill inside it still packed in the woven bags that have not been touched since the outermost casing stones were laid over them. Above the pyramid, Mayor, the sky is the color of the desert, pale at the horizon, deepening overhead. The stars that rise over the eastern hills in the hours before dawn are the same stars that rose over those hills when the mound was being built. The constellations have shifted slightly in their positions over 5,000 years, a consequence of the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that astronomers call precession. But the stars themselves are the same stars, and the sky above the Supe Valley is still dark enough, away from the light of Lima, to show them clearly. Whether the builders of Corral watched the stars is not a question the archaeology has resolved. The solar alignments suggested by the mound orientations indicate a sustained attention to the movement of the sun through the year, which is practical astronomy in the sense of most direct use to an agricultural community. Know the solstices, know when the seasons turn, know when to plant, and when to expect the harvest. Whether this attention extended to the stars as well, whether the night sky over Carroll was something the city's residents watched and named and organized their ritual calendar around, is a question the record has not yet answered. The absence of an answer is not the same as an absence of sky watching. It simply means that if it happened, it left no trace the archaeology has yet found or interpreted. Many things that happened at Carroll left no trace. The conversations held in the residential quarters, the names by which people called the mounds, the music played on the 32 flutes in whatever combination, at whatever ceremony, on whatever night or morning was chosen for the occasion. These things happened. They left no record. The site holds what it holds, and what it holds is already more than anyone looking at the pale, flat-topped mounds from Cossack's survey plane in the 1940s could have imagined was there. On the examination table in the conservation facility, beside the row of flutes, the dark cloth holds the quipu. The primary cord runs horizontally, its cotton fibers twisted together into a rope no thicker than a finger. From it, the pendant cords hang downward, each one a different length, each one bearing its knots at positions that follow a pattern still being studied.